Oh,
in the
from City Hall,
papers.
never mind.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You got-
Councilmember Brewer, just give us 2 seconds.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to start our hearing today. So at this time, will Sergeant start the recordings?
Recording in progress.
Recording to the computer on the way.
Cloud recording has started.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome to today's hybrid New York City Council hearing for the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. At this time, would all panelists please turn on the video for verification purposes. To minimize disruptions upon speaking, please place all electronic devices to vibrate or silent mode. If you'd like to submit testimony, please send via email to testimony@council.nyc.gov. Again, if you'd like to submit testimony, send to testimony@council.nyc.gov. Thank you for your cooperation. Chair, we are ready to begin.
Good morning and welcome everyone to the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. I'm Keith Powers, the chair of this committee. Before we begin the hearing, I want to introduce the council members of this committee who have joined us today. We're joined by Minority Leader Joe Borelli. We're joined by Councilmember Justin Brannan, Councilmember Gail Brewer, Councilmember Sylvina Brooks Powers, Councilmember Crystal Hudson. We're going to hold there for 1 second.
All members online, we're going to stand at ease for a moment to work out some audio issues. Thank you for your patience.
This is Sergeant Torrance Rafael Perez. Could you, Sergeant Biondo, can you hear me on the Zoom?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to keep going. So once more, we're joined by, I'm going to do this one more round. Minority Leader Joe Borelli, Councilmember Justin Brannan, Councilmember Gail Brewer, Councilmember Sylvina Brooks Powers, Councilmember Crystal Hudson, Councilmember Rafael Salamanca, Councilmember Parina Sanchez, and we will be momentarily joined by our speaker, Adrienne Adams.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is
Going to ask folks to please mute. Thank you. I want to also today acknowledge our Rules Committee Counsel Lance Pallavi, and also filling in David Seitzer, staff members of the Council's Investigative Unit, Francesca Della Vecchia, Director of the Compliance and Investigations Unit, investigators Alicia Vassal and Ramses Boudin, and of course always Chuck Davis, who's here somewhere. Today the Rules Committee will consider the nomination of Layla Bozorg to the City Planning Commission. Ms. Bozorg has been nominated by the Manhattan Borough President, Mark Levine. Should she be appointed, she'll be eligible to serve the remainder of a 5-year term that expires on June 30th, 2024. Before we begin, just a little bit of background on the City Planning Commission. Pursuant to the New York City Charter, the City Planning Commission must consist of 13 members, with 7 appointments, which include the appointments of the chair made by the mayor, 1 appointment each made by the public advocate and each borough president. All members except the chair are subject to the advice and consent of the City Council. According to the charter, the members should be chosen for their independence, integrity, and civic commitment. CPC members other than the chair are not considered regular city employees, and there's no limitation on the number of terms a CPC member may serve. However, CPC members are prohibited from holding any other city office while serving on the CPC. CPC has several responsibilities, and some of their duties include engaging in planning, focus on the city's orderly growth, improvement, and future development, which involve considerations concerning appropriate resources for housing, business, industry, recreation, and culture, overseeing and coordinating environmental reviews mandated by the state's environmental conservation law, preparing required reports, and also establishing various rules, including establishing minimum standards for certifying ULURP applications and establishing criteria associated with the selection of sites for capital projects. The member who is designated as vice chair receives an annual salary of $73,855. The other members receive an annual salary of $64,224. Welcome to Ms. Bozorg, and thank you for being here today. Before we have you make an opening statement, we're just going to ask you to raise your right hand and to be sworn in.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and to respond honestly to councilmember questions?
I do.
Good. Well, welcome and thank you and for being here today. And of course, if you'd like to make an opening statement, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Good morning, Chair Powers and Speaker Adams, and distinguished members of the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. I want to thank you all first for being here and for considering my nomination by the Manhattan Borough President, Mark Levine, to the City Planning Commission. As Councilmember Powers mentioned, my name is Layla Bozorg. I'm really honored and humbled to be here to talk about my qualifications and to take any questions that you have. So, as the queer daughter of immigrants whose parents fled an unstable political environment in Iran following the 1979 revolution, grappling with inclusivity and mobility, what it means to search for, build home, and sustain community are all issues that have been part of my life as far back as I can remember. Becoming and being an urban planner has truly felt like second nature to me, and working on housing and neighborhood policies as social, political, and economic matters has been at the heart of my entire career. Currently, I'm the Chief of Strategy and Policy at a nonprofit called NYC Kids Rise, where we're working to not only ensure that every public school kindergartner graduates with a financial resource for higher education and has the opportunity to build wealth, but also working to support the ecosystem of institutions, individuals, and organizations that make up a child's entire neighborhood and therefore impact their chances of success. Prior to joining NYC Kids Rise in October of 2020, I served for 6 years at the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, both as a chief of staff to the commissioner under former Commissioner Vicki Bean, and later as deputy commissioner for neighborhood strategies under former Commissioner Maria Torres Springer. Under my leadership at HPD, my teams were responsible for everything from neighborhood planning initiatives, which resulted in projects like the Brownsville Neighborhood Plan in Brooklyn and the Resilient Edgemere Plan in Queens, to citywide requests for proposals on public sites, including bringing all of those sites through the land use process, which the Commission considers. I helped create new innovative initiatives such as HPD's Big Ideas for Small Lots competition, a shared housing RFEI that explored various co-housing models across the city. I also played a central role in getting the agency to operationalize advocacy demands for permanent affordability on public sites through the use of a legal tool that gives the city a remainder interest on land that it disposes of. I also oversaw the agency's entire rental assistance and voucher program, which, as you know, serves approximately 39,000 households across the 5 boroughs, the vast majority with housing choice vouchers. What I am perhaps most proud of from my time at HPD was managing the extensive process to create the city's Fair Housing Plan, also known as Where We Live NYC. To create the plan, we engaged stakeholders from across the city's diverse neighborhoods, from everyday residents to those in protected classes, households being served by various types of housing subsidies, advocates, professionals, over 30 government agencies that intersected with fair housing issues. We coupled this, what we call qualitative data, through engagement with extensive quantitative analysis to lay out the existing conditions across a range of fair housing issues and indicators across the entire city. And we developed a set of fair housing goals and strategies to make our city a more just place to live. Prior to joining HPD in 2014, I served from 2010 to 2014 at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, first as a presidential management fellow and ultimately as a senior advisor working on initiatives that were aimed at preserving at-risk HUD-financed housing projects across the entire country. I'm excited to bring these various experiences and the perspectives they have provided me to the City's Planning Commission, where I will continue to work for more access to better opportunities for all New Yorkers, but especially those that have been historically marginalized or excluded. The challenges we face as a city, challenges of affordability, of livability, of health, equity, and inclusion are many. But thankfully, there are also so many resources that our city has at its disposal, and so many willing partners, including all of you in the council, that want to be part of the solutions. It's not lost on me that I'd be stepping into this role on the commission during a time when fellow New Yorkers' trust in the land use process has weakened. Indeed, we must rebuild that trust and strengthen our land use processes so that they provide for more and different types of housing, thriving job centers, better access to open space, resilient infrastructure, healthy commercial corridors, safe streets, and critical amenities, all of which must be more accessible to people with disabilities across every neighborhood. I have a deep respect for the role the Commission plays in working towards these outcomes through the land use process, along with other stakeholders such as yourself and the Council. But no entity can take on these challenges alone. Ultimately, it's also going to require strong partners in the administration, and particularly at the Department of City Planning, to engage New Yorkers in creating a strategic citywide framework for growth and development that can guide us towards a more visionary future. I'm optimistic that the city is well positioned to deliver on this through the leadership of Chair Garodnick. I would be thrilled, pending confirmation, to join other commissioners in helping to ensure that the city's land use processes and projects from across the 5 boroughs contribute to a more affordable, resilient, accessible, and inclusive city, one that offers agency, stability, opportunity, and a real sense of belonging for all. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here before you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, and congratulations on your nomination and for joining us here today. We're now joined also by Speaker Adams, so I want to kick it over to for a few questions, and then I'll take it from there. Thanks.
Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, thank you.
Congratulations on your candidacy for this very important role, and we welcome you to this hearing this morning. I am just going to go ahead and just begin by asking a couple of questions. And we're really excited. We hear, by the way, nothing but glowing, just glowing remarks about you.
Oh,
so
thank you.
I want to say that also. I'm just curious to know what is your view on land use as it's going along right now in the city of New York? What is the best thing about the process? And what is the worst thing about the process?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for being here. So I think the land use process right now feels a little broken to a lot of New Yorkers, and it's hard, and I see why New Yorkers are feeling that way. It can often feel like there's undue pressure on any one specific community to solve all our city's problems when a project comes through. It can feel like there's undue pressure on one specific council member to solve these problems when a project comes through. One of the things that I think works about at least the way the land use process was designed and is structured is that in theory, it gives voice to a lot of different types of stakeholders, right? And it has, community boards which are theoretically representative of communities, various types of elected officials who were elected by their constituencies have a voice in the process. The city council land use committee, which is, the city planning commission, which is supposed to take a citywide view on projects. Land use committee similarly is supposed to be able to zoom in and zoom out. And then the city council and the mayor ultimately having a decision to make. To me, in theory, that should work. I think some of the practices that have, some of the way, though, that in practice it has played out has clearly not worked. There's often undue voice given to people that are just the loudest and who have the time on their hand to show up at meetings. There's not necessarily enough engagement, or it can feel that way when projects are coming through, that it feels too late to engage a community at the point of it being in the land use process, that there should be thoughtful engagement before, and often it feels like people are just learning about the project once it's at land use. So I think that's one of the core issues where people feel like their only point of being engaged is actually when it's already in land use, when really, in theory, it should be well before that point. So those are some of the challenges. I also think, right now, there's not a lot of, there is this undue pressure on a single council member, it feels, in the process, when really the responsibility is a collective responsibility, not just on the public, but every stakeholder in the process, to try to get projects through that are going to contribute to our citywide needs while balancing those local needs. That balance feels completely thrown off to a lot of the public right now, and I've seen it thrown off in practice as well.
How do you see yourself contributing to helping with that?
I think that the commission, I would be one of multiple commission members, but I do think the commission, in working with DCP, has a role to play in helping to frame out a little bit more the citywide context that these projects that are coming through the process are living within, and to frame that out for the public better. I think that, my background at HPD also, I think there is a major responsibility, and I would just be a voice in echoing this, that of the agencies to be kind of engaging communities in the neighborhoods that these projects are coming through well in advance, to ensure that these projects are in some way meeting the needs of those local communities, or at least have taken that into deep consideration. That's not necessarily the role of one commissioner to do, but I would add voice to that need, and to encouraging the agencies to take kind of that more collective, neighborhood-based approach to thinking about these projects.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for that thoughtful question. You talked about this a little bit, but in your testimony, you make the comment, we must rebuild that trust and strengthen our land use process so they provide for more different types of housing, thriving job centers, access to open space, resilient infrastructure, healthy commercial quarters, safe streets, critical amenities.
Yeah.
I'm just borrowing from your testimony. Can you talk more about that? I think you've spoken a little bit in your answer to the speaker, but strengthening our land use processes, what are some ideas you have for how to do that?
I think that there needs to be a lot more engagement before a project is coming to kind of entering into ULURP. So that's one piece of it. I think, even though people think of just ULURP as our land use process, I think of our land use process as the entire process of formulating a project and getting it through completion. So I think we need in the city just more neighborhood planning efforts that are where zoning may be part of that conversation that comes up and part of the solutions that are proposed, but we need actual neighborhood planning initiatives where, with thoughtful engagement, and community boards have an important role to play, but we need to engage beyond that as well. So I think meaningful neighborhood planning is a starting point. Within then the land use process, I think it really needs to be informed by a broader citywide framework. That is, to me, the responsibility of the commission, but also of the Department of City Planning and other agencies, to be putting forward to the public and engaging and getting meaningful input on what a citywide framework for growth or development is, so that when in the land use process a project is coming through, people understand how it is meeting citywide goals, what the trade-off is between citywide and local issues, et cetera. And another piece of this for me is just coming up with actual land use proposals that kind of address some of what you read back and what I laid out, right? So instead of so much pressure on just individual projects, maybe thinking more collectively and broadly about citywide text amendments, so that there's not just undue pressure on one site, but thinking about things like zoning for quality and affordability in the last administration, or some of the citywide text amendments that we're hearing about now as potential new ideas, which allow for kind of broad changes that would facilitate the types of housing that we know are needed across the city, so that so much pressure is not just on one individual project, or all these fights aren't taking place on the back of one project. There are ways of approaching this with more of a citywide lens.
Can you describe how you balance the critical need for more affordable housing in New York City, which you've addressed and talked about, with concerns from communities about infrastructure, displacement, and affordability?
Yeah, so I'm of two minds of that. There is absolutely a need for us to be doing, typical city planning, and I don't mean just city planning processes, but planning for infrastructure that meets our current needs as well as considering future needs. When it comes to the balance of planning for housing and planning for infrastructure, sometimes, just in my experience at HPD, we will hear concerns about infrastructure as a way to block housing. And sometimes it's a very sincere need that the city has not responded to. So I think it's a case-by-case situation. I think the city absolutely needs to be planning with in every district on infrastructure. But we also have to be careful that when we hear, especially when it comes to affordable housing, communities not wanting it because of infrastructure needs, sometimes there's a disingenuous argument there. And so it really, to me, requires leaderships at every level to be kind of listening closely and trying to, weigh this and understand, are we talking about real risks? How do we address those real concerns? What are the needed infrastructures that are need to be made, needed infrastructure investments we have to make before this housing gets built? The other thing is housing does take quite a long time to build. So often we're having these conversations probably 5-6 years before a building's actually going to get built. And so there can be time for more planning as well.
Thanks for that. Can you talk about a large-scale rezoning that you believe was successful, and what lessons do you think can be applied from that rezoning to future rezonings?
Yeah, I shared that I think Essex Crossing has been generally very successful, especially given the history of that site. It involved really, when I say meaningful engagement, there were groups that represented really diverse parts of the communities surrounding the area that were given a real seat at the table as part of the task force, and also a sustained seat. It wasn't just checking in with folks and moving on. You had really close partnerships across city government agencies that were very committed to listening, understanding the history, listening to local concerns. You had really interesting cross-subsidization of new retail and kind of historic retail that was coming back to the site, and then cross-subsidization of housing and deeply affordable housing. So it's a really nice mix of factors, I think, that came into play on that site. So I think, and obviously one of the things that is very hard to replicate, but made that project a success too, was the way that city was able to actually serve some of the people that were originally displaced from the site many years previously. So I think some of the learnings broadly are around just what it actually looks like when communities do have a meaningful seat at the table and feel like they are actually part of the decision making throughout every type of decision that's getting made. So I think that's one piece of it. I think the financing is it was a very expensive project. That also is hard to replicate, but that's also a decision for some of these types of projects that it's maybe worth sometimes needing to provide more subsidy to get the type of cross-subsidization and type of diversity of housing and diversity of retail that folks are looking for. So I think the finance piece of that was also very interesting.
Great, thanks for that. I have some more questions, but I want to go to some colleagues first. So I'm going to now kick it over to Councilmember Brooks Powers, followed by Councilmember Borelli and Councilmember Hudson.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you to the committee staff for facilitating today's hearing. It's a pleasure to meet you in person, Ms. Bozorg. And so, Ms. Bozorg, as you may know, my district, which is the 31st Council District covering parts of Southeast Queens and the Rockaways, has seen a tremendous explosion of new development in recent years. Rockaway in particular is rife with new multi-story buildings, bringing a large influx of new residents, thanks in part to city initiatives like the Far Rockaway rezoning, Arvin East, Resilient Edgemere, and my staff and I have been coordinating a surprising number of ULURP proposals in my year and change in office, quite honestly. And the sudden increase at one time in density has not come with much needed investment in infrastructure and resources. My constituents have been deprived of critical services like healthcare providers in Rockaway. And with the closure of Peninsula Hospital last decade, took away the only trauma center easily accessible for many residents on a geographically isolated peninsula. My constituents are still struggling to find convenient access to quality care. On the other hand, our communities have found ourselves overburdened in other ways. The unintended consequences is what I'll call it from some of what we've been seeing, which has resulted in the siting of a number of transient shelters versus permanent housing, permanent affordable housing, permanent affordable homeownership opportunities. And also a number of hotels came that were converted into shelters also. And prior to the current administration, what was done repeatedly without adequate community engagement or approval, Community Boards 12, 13, and 14 host the majority of the shelter beds in Queens. And so I was happy to hear you talk about the brokenness in the system and the process. And I'm interested in digging deeper to understand what broken looks like to you. And also in that context, I'd like to ask a couple of other questions, particularly given your extensive experience with HPD. So as the former Deputy Commissioner of Neighborhood Strategies and Division of Tenant Resources, how did you negotiate community outreach and engage residents around the importance of preserving the neighborhood footprint? Furthermore, how has your time at HPD impacted your perspective on the work of city planning on the commission? What changes would you make to the CPC's process in terms of community engagement? How do you intend to improve CPC's application process and assess sightings holistically? And lastly, how did HPD analyze potential community impact? And if you need me to repeat anything else, let me know. I know there's a lot of questions. I know I'm limited on time, so I just want to throw it all out. But you get the gist.
Yes, I think I get the gist, and I really appreciate everything you're saying. And I do know that there has been a lot of work taking place in your district, and a lot of that is coming from following years of disinvestment as well. So I think fully can appreciate some of that tension at play. So let me think of where to start. In terms of, I think I'll start backwards and then if I miss some of where we started, please let me know. So in terms of how my time at HPD leading these teams, I think the question was, how has that informed how I would kind of approach some of the planning issues. So my teams at HPD, when I became deputy commissioner, I was the second deputy commissioner of something called the Office of Neighborhood Strategies. It had just been created at the beginning of the administration, actually, to help HPD shift from kind of a project-by-project view of its work to think about how our projects, the land that the city owns, and the investments we're making, which are housing investments that also facilitate other types of investments, are actually serving neighborhoods and not just specific sites, and not looked at as just site-specific, in a site-specific context. So one of the first things we did actually was create something called a neighborhood planning playbook, and that's something I think I'm really proud of, but it really lays out a process that is, and we created that playbook through engagement with various types of groups, and residents across the city. But it really lays out a transparent process that I think can inform a lot of our land use processes, where you begin by just organizing with people. What is it we're studying here? What are the issues? Who needs to be engaged? What are the voices historically that have been left behind? What are the voices historically that have had a lot of power in decision making? And how do we kind of lay out a plan from there? So there's like an organized phase, there's a learn phase, going out and learning from residents, doing data analysis, and collecting all your facts. Then there's a co-creation phase where you actually work with and use your professional skills as planners to actually engage communities to come up with actual strategies that meet the issues that people are raising up, right? So facilitating actual co-creation of strategies to meet the issues that folks are raising up. And then working to finalize that with folks. And the idea with this playbook was that you're very transparent about the entire process from the start. You make clear when it starts and ends, what the different entry points are, so that you're not wasting people's times either. One of the things that we deal with in the city often is this planning fatigue. So that kind of approach of being very transparent, clear, meaningful is something I would bring to how I approach my work on the commission as well. Again, I think as I mentioned, the commission alone is not responsible and can't go out and do community planning, but we can really demand that of projects of the other stakeholders and agencies involved. So I would be a voice kind of on that side.
And I would just add also, because in looking at your responses to some of the questions and just some of my observations, even with engaging with the CPC, engaging with HPD, oftentimes, we understand New York has a housing crisis, but we also recognize that there are some communities that are, I think, focused on a bit more, and it's not really distributed equitably. And then even when it is, because as you mentioned, my community has been underinvested for many years, but even with the development that has come, not all of the necessary infrastructure investments has come along with it. It's been like a partial way, and I think it's important when city planning approaches community development that it really looks holistically, not at one particular project, but also the ones that are adjacent to the the proposed site. And so I would love to have a commitment for you that, should you be appointed to this role, that you would be committed to centering the community's voices and bringing out the lens when we look at these projects, so that they could be more responsible development that's happening, as opposed to just building everywhere in the name of having to address a crisis. Because I think it creates, like I said before, unintended consequence when we do that, that really casts a burden on these communities.
Yeah, I fully hear you and agree, especially on that development has not played out equitably or equally in all neighborhoods. I think one of the realities too that I think your community has experienced is, a lot of affordable housing development in the city has occurred on land that HPD or the city has historically owned that from the 70s and 80s, when the city had to take a lot of property that was abandoned in REM. And so a lot of the development now occurs, affordable housing development occurs where HPD had land. One of, I think, the biggest challenges we all face now is how to encourage the right types of development in higher amenity neighborhoods so that there's not undue pressure just where HPD owned historically land to, build as much. I mean, it's a both and, but we need to do more to be making sure that there is more development occurring in some of these higher amenity neighborhoods as well, while bringing amenities. It's kind of what we call this both and approach, but or balanced approach, bringing amenities to neighborhoods that have had a lot of development, but maybe not the other types of investments that communities need.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just before she has to run, I think Speaker Adams have one more question.
Thank you, Majority Leader. Ms. Bozog, I'm kind of refreshed by your responses. Councilmember Brooks Powers and I do share community boards in Southeast Queens, and I'm a former chair of the second largest in Queens. And I'm just interested to know, in our relationships in the past with the city and working with community boards, it's been a little bittersweet. So I just want to know, how would you elevate those relationships between the city, between the CPC and our community boards?
Between the CPC and the community boards? The relationship between those two?
Yes, and I apologize. I've got the hotline and the red
That's
phone
okay.
right now.
Thank you. And thank you for your
Who's gonna take
question.
that answer?
I mean, I think part of it is working to ensure that that the commission is actually hearing from all voices that represent a community. And that is often the community boards, but it's often much more than the community boards. And I think that as a planner and as policymakers, it's always been a tension we all grapple with, is how to make sure we're actually hearing from folks that don't necessarily have the time to be on a community board, but are just as impacted as community board members, and how to make sure community boards are being held accountable to being representative of their entire communities. I think this is not something just for the City Planning Commission to solve, but I think that the entire kind of ecosystem of players in the land use process, we all need to, and it's agencies as well, this is not just a community board issue, and I don't mean to imply that, need to be coming up with different ways to be hearing from different types of constituents that are speaking not just to our current needs, but our future needs as well. I mean, one of the things we heard so much when I was at HPD was people talking about wanting their own kids being priced out of their neighborhood when they were old enough to be able to rent a home. So we need to not just think of kind of our current needs, but our future needs as well. And that requires also trying to think about those who don't have a voice in the current moment that a project's coming through.
Great, thank you. Right now, we're going to move to Councilmember Borelli, and then Councilmember Hudson, Councilmember Ressler.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony and for the questions that you answered. Can you just describe your opinions and thoughts on single-family zoning? It's been a controversial topic in other cities, and there's been discussion here. Can you just describe your opinions on it?
Well, I think specifically in New York, single-family zoning is such a small part of our zoning districts. So unlike some other cities nationally where the conversation is, let's get rid of single-family zoning, and that's going to solve a lot of their housing crisis issues, we don't have quite the same kind of balance. So it hasn't been kind of a central strategy in my mind that is going to kind of solve some of what we're trying to solve for. I do think, just full transparency, I helped lead the city's fair housing plan. I do think that some of the historic practices in creating single-family zoning and some of the deed restrictions that, some homes still carry those, even though they're not operational, there were a lot of practices in single-family communities that have created exclusion, created the type of segregation we face. So I don't ignore those issues, but I also don't think that in New York, the conversation is the same as like Minneapolis, where so much more of the city is actually zoned as single-family zoning. So I do think it's important for us to look at how every community can be contributing to the types of citywide needs we have. And I don't think single-family districts should be alleviated of that responsibility of being part of the solution. But yeah.
And then the other question I have is your general thoughts on cars and whether parking requirements are important in some neighborhoods and necessities, or whether you think that every part of the city should transition away from car use and parking, et cetera.
Well, I think there are definitely parts of the city where we should be reducing or even eliminating our parking requirements to make way for other amenities and more housing, and so that the cost of a project can go more towards some of the citywide needs or even the housing needs we have than parking. I think that has to be looked at neighborhood by neighborhood, district by district. I think there are a lot of districts where historically there wasn't enough transportation investment for people to be able to get to jobs without cars. So we can't ignore that and just turn off a switch. But I do think to be a more resilient city, to be a more equitable city, we do need to move away from as much car use. It's a serious environmental issue. It's a serious mobility issue. So it's a tough conversation, but I think it has to be looked at across the neighborhoods and different types of zoning districts.
But just to be clear, you are not going on the City Planning Commission with grand designs to end single-family zoning and end car ownership in the city?
Not personally.
Okay, great. Can you just discuss some of the circumstances where you would feel, let me put this in context. Your borough president, who appointed you, is a friend of all of ours. He was a member of this body, and I'm sure he can remember having many conversations in the members' lounge, as do many members of the council, where we moan and groan about city planning and why we think they're not doing the right thing, and et cetera, et cetera. That said, can you give us an idea of the circumstances where you feel you would be justified in voting against the desires of the community board and council member of an area?
Yeah, I think we all...
I want you to say no, you'll never do that. I'm hoping for that answer.
What'd you say?
I'm hoping you just say no, I'd never do that.
Yeah. I vowed to tell the truth, so I'll say I think it's more complicated than that, and I think that's part of how we all have different roles in the land use process and all have different kind of lenses and different... this isn't to say I don't think the commission should be listening to local voices as much as council members need to, but I do think there's this balance that needs to be struck between balancing local concerns and local issues with citywide needs, and that's kind of at the heart of a lot of our really challenging conversations. So I think the circumstances, it's hard to answer in the hypothetical, and I think, and I just want to be transparent that I can't say that every time a community votes against something that in my position on the commission, I would vote against it too. It really would have to be very case specific to understand what are the root of those concerns when someone's voting no, how do those, are they speaking to real citywide risks and local risks that should counterweigh whatever citywide benefit the project is purportedly making. So I would say I would just have to really look at the specifics.
You mentioned, I think correctly, the sort of the disconnect between the public and the City Planning Commission, sort of the broken nature of the land use system. Do you think that's because community boards and council members, each of whom represent districts larger than most American cities, do you feel that that constituents believe that in a system where the only elected person and the only elected body that governs them is ignored in favor of a citywide body of which some members might not have ever stepped foot in the district?
So
I know I'm asking a real metaphysical question.
yeah, well, and I also want to, since you made the comparison to other places, I do want to clarify, while I think there are broken pieces of our land use process, I don't think the whole thing is broken, and when you look comparatively at other types of land use processes, we have something that's stronger than other models out there, and I think there's a real, it has been challenging, and there are pieces that need to be strengthened and fixed, but I don't think the core issue we're facing is just a broken land use process. I do think the process allows for the council and the mayor and other stakeholders to vote with the member and consider, those very local issues and balance them against citywide issues. And it also allows, it could go either way. I mean, it's really, it's just depends on the practices, and the process allows for both. And so I do think it's really ends up being case specific, and that's why it's very, I completely hear and understand the tension you're speaking to, but I think that tension is kind of the heart historically and today and into the future of how challenging land use is, balancing these very real local concerns with an obligation to be doing things that advance the city in the direction it needs to go in.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to go to Councilmember Hudson, followed by Councilmember Ressler, Sanchez, and then I think Brooks Powers has a follow-up.
Thank you so much, Chair. Hello, good to see you.
Likewise.
I'm excited for your nomination by the Borough President, and congratulations. My question is just, this is a time when the city faces a deep and really seemingly unrelenting housing crisis. And we know it's important to build more housing, but also to prevent the mass displacement of Black and brown folks and extremely low-income New Yorkers, those who have quite literally made the city what it is and keep the city going. So my question is, how do you plan to reconcile the need for more housing with the need to also build housing specifically for low and moderate income New Yorkers with the greatest need?
Thanks for that question. This gets at the heart of a lot. I think part of what you're getting at is a lot of what we look at and talk about when trying to figure out, threading this needle of fair housing issues. How do you continue to build housing, which is important for, I want to say making the city more affordable, but it's really trying to stem the unaffordability of the city as much as possible. So how do you balance that with the real lived experience of people who are being displaced as a result of the housing crisis we currently have today? So part of it is that it's, if we weren't building housing and if we continue to build housing at too slow of a pace, that displacement risk is even higher. And I think that's part of the concern sometimes is which is going to create more displacement for communities, more housing or less housing. So, and a piece of this for me is very much about what type of housing are we talking about and where are we talking about. Our city, we need to be doing much more development in higher amenity neighborhoods. What kind of HUD typically called high opportunity. I don't like that dichotomy personally, but there are a lot of neighborhoods where so little of the rental housing stock is affordable to low-income people. We need to switch that calculation. We need to be putting a lot of energy into communities that have not done their, not taken on enough development. That will alleviate pressures. But we also need to be very careful about the type of housing we're talking about. I think, I'm kind of a housing supply person, but I also don't think housing supply of unregulated housing is the only thing that's going to solve our problems. We have to have more tenant protections in place. We have to be making investments in preserving people's homes so that, and preserving the affordability of people's homes. So I think new housing has to be coupled with these other strategies. It's not just a housing supply issue, what you're speaking to.
Thank you. And you mentioned, you sort of addressed this a little bit, I think, with Councilmember Borelli's points about being nominated by the borough president. But I just want to sort of ask plainly, have you been empowered by the borough president to perhaps carry your values forward regardless of whether you might be a dissenting voice on the City Planning Commission?
Yes, he and his team have been very clear that I'm empowered to kind of use my judgment and with, in consultation, obviously. I think part of what we respect about each other is both of our approaches is about listening first, Even though I have the experience I shared, I am someone who doesn't think I know a lot, and I always want to hear what other people have to say. My disposition is to understand people's different perspectives before even shaping one of my own. So I think I have been empowered, but we've also discussed how we've both been committed to listening to very different types of voices and each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're now going to go to Councilor Ressler, who I believe is joining us remotely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Majority Leader. I have just one comment, which is to commend the Borough President of Manhattan for such an inspired choice, the City Planning Commission. I have had the privilege of working with Layla over the years, and she is incredibly smart, knowledgeable, values-driven, effective, pragmatic. We're just fortunate that the Borough President has selected somebody of such caliber to serve in this important role. And I am hopeful that the City Planning Commission will be a stronger, more effective, more responsive body with Layla serving on it. So I just wanted to express my strongest and most enthusiastic support for this nomination, and congratulations to you, Layla, on this opportunity to continue to serve New York City.
Thank you, Councilmember Ressler. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Councilmember Ressler. Nice to see you. We're now going to go to Councilmember Sanchez, and we'll be followed by follow-up from Councilmember Brooks Powers. So I think Councilmember Sanchez is one.
Good morning, and Layla, it's great to see you. Just echoing Councilmember Ressler's comments, I've had the privilege of working with you in your time in the administration, and even before that, when I was a community board member and an advocate working at RPA. It's just always been really incredible to watch you work and to watch how thoughtful you are. So I wanted to sort of follow up on a couple of the threads. Councilmember Borelli mentioned some of this with his question about when do you go against a local community board or local council member. Councilmember Hudson kind of touched on it, talking about, the displacement risk that, Black and brown communities face. And so, continuing along that thread, I'd be really curious to hear you talk about both how you'll think about it, how you'll talk about how you would talk about it with your colleagues on the CPC as a supply advocate. So we do need more housing in the city of New York. We're underproducing, but that shortage is so egregiously felt and exists among the lowest income New Yorkers, right? So just geographically, right? We saw in the HVS this week that Manhattan has a 10% vacancy rate, but the Bronx has a 0.78 vacancy rate. And then when you break down that vacancy rate by income level, it's really just the lowest income New Yorkers that are struggling the most, which, to me, of course, points that yes, there's a supply problem, but we have to make sure we're subsidizing those that need it the most in order to alleviate that pain that people are feeling. So to put this in the form of a question that is related to my colleagues' questions, when do you vote no on an affordable housing project? We had a project that almost came through the council, but was withdrawn at the last moment, 145, which would have offered some affordability, but not affordable to Harlem, not affordable to that community. And thinking about projects like that, projects that do something, but do not get at that deep level of affordability and those most key needs that the city has. How will you think about that, and how will you talk about that with your colleagues?
Thank you for being here and for your question, Councilmember Sanchez. I think to me, it's I spoke to this a little bit before, but it has to be considered as a potential both and. I don't think a project like the one you mentioned it's a private application. The responsibility and the developer, I'm not going to speak too much to that project. I actually don't know too many of the details, but the point I want to make is not every project can solve all of our problems, but each project has a role to play. And so the challenges you spoke to that the Housing Vacancy Survey also recently really highlighted, speak to the need for us to be putting a lot of subsidy towards building as much deeply affordable housing as possible. And so that's a government responsibility to be putting those resources in place, finding those sites, making the incentives right, because we need private developers. We don't have enough public land to build as much deeply affordable housing as we need, so we do need to incentivize private actors to be part of the solution as well. But I think it's a balance. So I think not every private application is going to be able to, will A, accept public subsidy to go deeper, or be able to kind of solve the deep affordability need necessarily. So I think it's our responsibility to push them to go as far as possible, while also acknowledging that there's another piece of our problems that this project may help alleviate or work towards. Not going to fully solve it. No single project is, and no, there's no way that just market rate development is going to solve our housing affordability crisis. I absolutely do not believe that. So it is this real balance of dedicating a lot of subsidy towards deep affordability and in a diverse set of neighborhoods. We cannot continue to just concentrate where we have land necessarily our deep affordability. We really have to be looking to build in a lot of different types of neighborhoods and giving opportunity for low-income residents to live in different types of neighborhoods and choose to apply and choose to live in different types of neighborhoods, particularly families with children. I think one of the things I just want to mention that as a houser I've always been deeply concerned about is how little family housing we're able to build in higher amenity neighborhoods. And we know that the impact on children is greater than any other population when we're able to house them in higher amenity neighborhoods.
Thank you so much. And I see I'm out of time, but if the chair would permit me one more question.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So Leila, I suppose, you said a couple of times, we can put a lot of pressure on a single project. We can put a lot of pressure on a single council member to solve this crisis that the city is facing as a whole. And one thing that a lot of folks have advocated for in the past years, myself included, has been for a comprehensive plan for the city of New York, or a comprehensive planning framework that allows us to really have a citywide conversation about what is the role that different communities have to addressing this crisis, right? And what is the city's responsibilities to fund or secure the resources to build the infrastructure needed to support growth where we want to see it. But in my experiences in working with the administration, and before that as an advocate who was on the outside pushing for comp planning, there's always been a pushback to having that sort of conversation on a citywide scale. So as you go and think about joining the Planning Commission, how do you think about comprehensive planning in the city of New York? Do you think that's an idea that is worth talking more about?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I am of the mind that we absolutely need to be planning comprehensively, and that there needs to be a citywide framework that is guiding our investments and is transparent and understandable to New Yorkers. So I do think there is much more we can and should be doing, and when I say we, I mean really the city can and should be doing to be putting out a vision that also engages people, that it includes neighborhood level planning, but presents a citywide framework. I have I have been wary of some of the calls for comprehensive planning when it starts to sound like a 5, 6, 10-year process where people think we're going to all come to agreement on where housing should be built. And I don't have optimism that that's something we can all come to agreement on, or that every council member is going to sign off on. And I get nervous that becomes a kind of way of just slowing down the progress we need to make. So I think it's about, it's about presenting a citywide framework, developing a citywide framework that New Yorkers can understand and trust, knowing that we're never going to get everyone to agree, and that we still need to be moving forward with projects to kind of stem what would happen if all projects stalled.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Leila, and best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to Councilmember Brooks Powers, followed by Councilmember Salamanca.
Thank you. So when I think about the City Planning Commission, I think about all of the opportunity it presents for communities and development and what that looks like. And then going back to what I was saying before in terms of the unintended consequences that I've seen, I think it's important to be able to find that balance between the city priorities and issues to address some of those concerns and crises that we face as a city, but at the same time find a way to take into account what that looks like on the ground, because oftentimes the commission will present something and locally, and I can speak just from a local perspective, there's always seems to be a disconnect, and I think that Councilmember Hudson said it pretty eloquently, looking at the Black and brown communities and the impact. And some of what I've seen that has been unintended consequence has led to gentrification, as well as further segregation. When I think about Southeast Queens and going to your point earlier about communities that have historically been transportation deserts, that still exists, right? There have been times where I've said, I'm going to take the train into City Hall, and it takes 2 hours each way to get there. And when I do my transportation tours to try to get to some of my colleagues' districts, there sometimes are routes that take over 3 hours for me to be able to get there. So when you think about development and parking, as Councilmember Minority Leader Borelli had stated, it's important to not diminish the need for parking because the investments in transportation are not going at the same rate and speed, unfortunately, as development.
Right.
And so the unintended consequences means that people are closed out of economic opportunity because they cannot realistically get from point A to point B. And then with the development, similarly in Black and brown communities like Southeast Queens, where it's the largest concentrated area of Black home ownership, those type of communities have to be prioritized and protected. They are historic communities that are just very far and few in between in terms of opportunity for generational wealth. And so I'm interested in understanding your thoughts on how you plan to leverage your role on the commission in terms of the balancing of the city issues and the local dynamics that exist so that it would prevent further segregation and further gentrification that has been happening as a result of some of these actions.
Thank you for that question. I think part of balancing these issues is not just listening to them, but also developing real solutions that are sometimes outside of housing. What you're talking about is also the need for us to be very thoughtful about job centers and about how we get to job centers, and balancing that need with the type of development that's happening. So that's city planning. That's the commission has some responsibility on that. The Department of City Planning has and transportation agencies. But that is where it's not just about finding a way to pass housing projects, but really being accountable to different communities about the different types of investments that need to be made to alleviate affordability. Affordability is not just a housing issue. It's also about your time and money to get to work. It's about how many resources you need to spend to be able to get your child to a good school. When I talk about affordability, I'm not just talking about housing solving that issue. And I think planning, and planning comprehensively in a community and with a community cannot just be about housing needs. We need to think about how other city commitments and investments kind of are part of the equation of solving the challenges that residents face.
Thank you for that. And I just really would like to close and say, I ask that you use your voice, if you're appointed to this, and champion that. Because communities like the ones that I represent have been really impacted. We need the investments in our community,
Right.
but not at the sake of losing our Black and brown homeowners, not at the sake of pushing Black and brown low-income people out of the community that they've called home for many generations. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, we'll go to our land use chair, Councilmember Salamanca.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
First, I want to congratulate you.
Thank you.
On getting here and just reviewing your resume when I got it, and then just sitting here and looking at your package. You are extremely qualified, and just want to congratulate you.
Thank you.
On this. I know that Councilmember Sanchez was touching up on this, and I want to touch up on this as well a little bit in terms of the positions that city planning takes when an application gets to the commission. Many times, well, I would say 99% of the times when a city planning approves an application and it goes through the ULURP process, and when it gets to the commission, 99% of the time, the commission approves it, regardless of the community opposition. And I wanted to get a sense from you when an application is before you. What's going to be your stance when there's an application and there's big community opposition, such as the community board and the borough president?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, and thank you for being here. So I think my position will be to really deeply listen and understand the facts at play and the perspectives at play. If there is that deep level of opposition, I want to hear why. I want to understand the history of kind of the concerns. Are these, and I know, and I'm not speaking to your district when I say this, but sometimes community opposition can come in the form of exclusionary interests, and sometimes it comes in the form of sincere concerns about the risk that this project presents to a neighborhood. And so it has to be looked at, to me, on the facts and understanding the root causes of the concerns that people are speaking to, and then being able to zoom out and balance how should this be weighed against whatever benefit is purportedly coming from this project, and is it worth it?
I know I heard 145 being one of the projects. One of the concerns that we had there was the tremendous opposition that there was, not from just the community, but the community board, the borough president, the local member, the local state elected officials there. But the project continued on, What is your take on building in areas that has max density compared to building density in communities that have very little density to fight back, this affordable housing crisis that we have?
You said compare, can you just repeat that?
So there are
last part?
areas
Sorry.
and communities such as, I would say, myself, Councilmember Sanchez, Diana Ayala, where we may be transit rich, we're low-income communities, we have high buildings, buildings, 6, 7-story buildings, depending on the area. Some areas are 20-story buildings. And we have other communities in the borough that have very small density, and there's an opportunity to build housing there. What is your position on that?
I think we need to look at kind of each type of residential district and understand where the real opportunities are to build more densely in a way that makes sense, while also doing the work to be protecting existing communities, protecting tenants. We can't do the building without the other tools that are designed to protect tenants and to improve neighborhoods. So we have to, I think, look at different types of districts, look at strategies that will help, create more density where it makes sense. But it does require a nuanced look at different types of zoning districts and understanding kind of what the strategies are. In some case, it may be a density factor issue. In some case, an FAR boost just for affordable housing makes sense. In some case, mapping MIH might make sense depending on the district. So I think it's really got to be looked at kind of district specific.
One of the main issues that we have as a city is the affordability of units, the AMI, the area median income. And I see that you worked at HUD for some time there, and the AMI structure, the way it's set for the city of New York, it just doesn't include the 5 boroughs, but it includes the counties, the surrounding counties, which makes our AMI for the federal government, the calculation, much higher than what it actually is in the city of New York. What can you do as a commissioner in the City Planning Commission to try to get the messaging out to the federal government to make this change?
So on this issue, I'd say, AMI, so first of all, HUD actually does have within its AMI calculation something called an adjustment factor for high-cost areas. So once an area kind of passes a threshold of certain cost, AMI is set in a different way than it is in other places to account for the high cost of that region. So there is already an adjustment factor in place. I want to clarify that. But it's helpful to think of AMI just as a benchmark. So just because HUD says the AMI of this area is X, that doesn't mean we need to build to that AMI. It's a benchmark for us as policymakers and for the agencies that control housing subsidy to then decide how much subsidy they need to put in a project to meet different income levels. So even if that calculation for some reason is flawed, we don't need to set it at that AMI. It's really just a benchmark for how much, the only thing that's going to make housing more affordable in that context you're speaking of is more subsidy. And so it's really about just, it's a benchmark to help policymakers decide how much subsidy to put in a project. So if the AMI is a certain number, and to get to low-income residents, you need to go to 60% of AMI, then you decide how much money you want to put in to get to that, or if you want to go to 30%, right? So it's really, I would think of it more as a benchmark than a calculation issue.
See, we have 5 boroughs. We want to build affordable housing in all 5 boroughs, and I understand that we need to be attentive to the amount of subsidy that you put into one project because it limits what you can do in another project, and so every year the AMI goes up. Finally, just to put on your radar, one of the challenges that I see, at least in my district, and I know it's happening to all of my colleagues, but I'll give an example of my district. There's land that we've rezoned under the context of affordable housing. I would say I have a project that was rezoned in 2018. HPD, till this day, has not closed on that project. As a result, that land has been sold to a different developer. It's at its third owner, the third developer. And that developer is committing to building affordable housing as the original plan. But if the city closes now on that project, the AMIs that we voted on in 2018 are totally different than the ones in 2022 because they can only go by the AMIs of that specific year. That's one challenge. The other challenge is if this developer doesn't get to close because it's 2 blocks down from the Metro North station, that the value of that land has gone up. And there are developers who want to pay more than what the land is worth because they know that they can build market rate in the South Bronx. And so how can city planning help out in terms of ensuring that projects that are being rezoned, you're talking to HPD to ensure that HPD can close on that project in a reasonable amount of time?
I mean, that takes the coordination and the commitment around subsidy and the accountability around commitments, because that part of what you're speaking to is a subsidy problem. If HPD can't close on a project, it's because it's got too many other projects in its pipeline. So it's about how to be accountable to whatever commitments are being made to that community about the timing of this project. Unfortunately, our city, things are constantly shifting, and so the AMI issue you're speaking to in that context is concerning, right? If commitments have been made about a certain AMI level and then the market has changed such that that AMI is now a higher set of incomes, that to me requires conversation with HPD about trying to meet the original commitments and putting more subsidy in the project in order to do that. And it becomes this the balancing act for HPD on where and how much subsidy to be putting in. And then this coordination you're talking about is absolutely critical, and I know Councilmember Brooks Powers' district has had this challenge as well, of just the timing of when a project's coming through, the expectations that are set about when it's going to close, and then other factors really impacting that is very challenging, and I know it does a disservice to the trust building that's needed with communities about believing what agencies are saying about when projects are going to get done. I understand that.
All right, well, we'll continue to have those conversations. I want to congratulate you and thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We do not have anyone currently signed up for public comments. We'll give them just a minute or so if folks would like to sign up virtually. We have no members of the press here now.
Thank you. It's so great to see you.
All right, I don't believe we have anyone here from the public, so we're going to say thank you to you for your thoughtful testimony and answers, and I want to thank all of my colleagues who participated in today's hearing. We're going to recess today's hearing and reconvene on Thursday, June 16th for a vote on this nomination. We'll see folks then. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Councilmember.